So in this video, I want to talk about the recent Washington Post article that seemed to put the Americans and the Ukrainians at odds. And we're going to go through this paragraph by paragraph. This is not for those sunshine soldiers and summer patriots. You got to really be interested and care about Ukraine to walk through this line by line with me, because that's what we're about to do. And you'll understand how the Washington Post framed it and how maybe the U.S. saw it one way and Ukrainians saw it a different way and what was going on. This is in a long string now of articles like this Time piece, which was really kind of a hit job on Zelensky, the way that it was done, or the Economist piece, which I think was pretty balanced, but that's where we get the language of stalemate from, the English translation to the word stalemate, which Zaluni used unless we have more materials. And as I'm going through this, the Senate and the House are trying to figure out if they're going to support Ukraine, to what degree they're going to support Ukraine. I think they're going to come to a deal, and it's just going to be a matter of time and negotiation, but they'll come to a deal. So 2 days ago, the Washington Post put out this piece. Miscalculations, divisions marked by offensive planning by U.S. and Ukraine. And they seem to paint it as they're on very different sides of how they're seeing it. That is partly the case, but there's more to the story. There's nuance. And so we're going to just walk our way through it, and I'm just going to read and talk about particular parts that I've highlighted. On June 15th, a conference room at the NATO headquarters in Brussels, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, flanked by a top U.S. commander, sat around a table with his Ukrainian counterpart. Austin, in his deliberate baritone, asked Ukrainian Defense Minister Reznikov, pressing him on why his forces weren't using Western-supplied mine-clearing equipment. Right? You'd think they'd want to use that, right? Without air support, he said, the only option was to use artillery to shell the lines, dismount from the targeted vehicles, and proceed on foot. Now, he's asking Reznikov to do something that the U.S. military would never dream of doing without the combined arms, overhead protection by air support. He says we can't maneuver because of the landmine density and tank ambushes. That's what Reznikov said, and I think that there's something very fair about that. A counteroffensive born in optimism has failed to deliver its expected punch, generating friction. Stop. That kind of line is the kind of line that will be repeated by American repeaters and Russian media. This line again, a counteroffensive born in optimism has failed to deliver its expected punch, generating friction, because they're going to seize this and use certain cherry-picked lines along the way, raising deeper questions about Ukraine's ability to retake decisive amounts of territory. And again, what they've taken in the counteroffensive was not a lot. This examination of the lead up to Ukraine's counteroffensive is based on interviews with more than 30 senior officials. I've already seen one podcast talking about this particular article, and it wasn't very complimentary. Okay, and we'll see more coming down, but we're informing you so you understand what's actually happened here. Key elements that shape the counteroffensive and the initial outcome include Ukrainian, U.S., and British military officers held 8 major tabletop war games to build a campaign plan, but Washington miscalculated the extent to which Ukraine's forces could be transformed into a Western-style fighting force in a short period, especially without giving Kyiv air power. Okay, so are they training up to NATO standards? Yes, they're trying to train them to operate like NATO nations would fight. But some of the training is shortcutted. Some of the training that is NATO standards is assuming that you're going to have air power or superiority in firing superiority, which they don't really have because they don't have all the equipment that they should have in order to do that. So there's a bit of a disconnect. Second, U.S. and Ukraine officials sharply disagreed at times over strategy, tactics, and timing. The Pentagon wanted the assault to begin in mid-April to prevent Russia from continuing to strengthen its lines. And unfortunately, the longer it went on, the more Russia got to strengthen its lines. The Ukrainians hesitated, insisting that they weren't ready without additional weapons and training. It took a while for the weapons to get there. They needed to get their people trained. Next, U.S. military officials were confident that the mechanized frontal attack on Russian lines was feasible. The simulations concluded that Kyiv's forces, in the best case, could reach the Sea of Azov and cut off Russian troops in the south in 60 to 90 days. Of course, that never materialized. The United States advocated a focused assault along that southern axis, but Ukraine's leadership believed that its forces had to attack in 3 distinct points along the 600-mile front. And so, They attacked here, they attacked here, they attacked here, as opposed to just one point and punching straight through. Which I get why they were doing that, but they felt that they had to stretch the Russians even further in order to be able to proceed. And that's understandable. The U.S. intelligence community had a more downbeat view than that of the U.S. military, assessing that the offensive only had a 50-50 chance. That's going to be another thing that will be pointed out again. Doug McGregor or Scott Ritter or the Duran or Redacted, I'm sure will say that line. Many in Ukraine and the West underestimated Russia's ability to rebound from battlefield disasters and exploit perennial strengths, manpower, minds, and willingness to sacrifice lives. Now, I've underestimated Russia too, but I underestimated this last part. Their willingness to sacrifice lives is actually just, it's terrible. And they're going to just keep coming, and they're not really worried about the casualties. Like, we look at the casualties mounting and go, wow, that's not good. They are not worried about that at all. As the expected launch of the offensive approached, Ukrainian military officials feared that they would suffer catastrophic losses, while American officials believed the toll would ultimately be higher without a decisive assault. I think they're both right. I think that they did suffer some pretty significant losses in the first few weeks and then backed off and went, we got to do something a little bit differently. But it will be higher because they weren't able to punch through and separate and create some kind of separation between these two distinct areas. It's going to be worse. I think they both got it right. The year began with Western resolve at its peak. Ukrainian forces highly confident, President Volodymyr Zelensky predicting a decisive victory. But now there's uncertainty on all fronts, and that's being played up in Russian media and through Russian media repeaters. International attention has been diverted to the Middle East. That certainly is not helping. We wanted faster results, Zelensky said in an interview with the Associated Press last week. From that perspective, unfortunately, we did not achieve the desired results, and that's a fact. He also said, look, this isn't a video game. This isn't a movie. This is like real life. Like, you got to get this right. Together, all these factors make a victory for Ukraine far less likely than years of war and destruction. So it looks like it's going to be a longer term thing than anybody bargained for. On New Year's this past year, I said, look, I don't think that we're going to be celebrating another New Year's with Ukraine being victorious. I think it's going to go beyond that. I think this is going to be a long war. Everything that I see shows me that the Russians have no intention of slowing down. And I think that's what's happening. The campaign's inconclusive and discouraging early months pose sobering questions. It's going to take years and a lot of blood, a British security official said, even if it's possible. So it's gone from, yes, they're doing it, they're going to push them out. Like, remember, like, when we saw the Kharkiv counteroffensive, like, that was pretty remarkable. But we're not going to see something like that again, it looks like. The year now stands to end with Russian President Vladimir Putin more certain than ever that he can wait out a fickle West, and that is his goal. His goal is to stay the course until the West gets tired and ignores it, has Ukraine war fatigue. So gaming out the battle plan. In a conference call in the late fall of 2022, after Kyiv had won back territory in the north and south, Austin spoke with General Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's top military commander, and asked him what would be needed for a spring offensive. Zaluzhny responded that he required 1,000 armored vehicles, 9 new brigades trained in Germany and ready for battle. I took a big gulp, Austin said later, according to an official with knowledge of the call. That's near impossible, he told colleagues. So, yeah, are you going to be able to supply him with that? It's going to be quite a stretch. In the first months of 2023, military officials from Britain, Ukraine, and the United States concluded a series of war games at a U.S. Army base in Germany. The sequence of 8 high-level tabletop exercises formed the backbone for the U.S.-enabled effort to hone a viable, detailed campaign plan. We brought in all the allies and partners together and really squeezed them hard to get additional mechanized vehicles, a senior official said. So they did work on getting them the material, but how fast can the material, the vehicles, the ammunition, how fast can that get to the battlefield? During the simulations, each of which lasted several days, so they were doing their homework, the planners ran exercises using a specialized wargaming software. Top officials there included Miley, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colonel Alexander Syrsky, the commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, attended several simulations and were briefed on the results. Miley spoke with Ukrainian Special Operations troops who were working with American Green Berets in the hope of inspiring them and said, quote, there should be no Russian who goes to sleep without wondering if they're going to get their throat slit in the middle of the night. Miley said, according to an official with knowledge of the event. You got to get back there and create campaign behind the lines. Well, that's easier said than done. It's a difficult thing to do, especially without air power being able to deliver them. But Western officials said war games affirmed their assessment that Ukraine would be best served by concentrating its forces on a single strategic objective. Okay, let's go back and look at this map again. The U.S. wanted them to do what? They wanted them to say, okay, we're going to take this one area and let's just cut right through here. The Ukrainians wanted to hold them in Bakhmut, or now hold them in Avdiivka, and then go through here and go through here and work there as well. They wanted to do all three simultaneously, and that wasn't necessarily going to give them the concentration. That was going to also keep the concentration of the Russians lower than it otherwise would be. So that's a positive, but it wasn't giving them what they needed. At the end of the day, though, it would be Zelensky, Zaluzhny, and other Ukrainian leaders who would make the decision, the former official noted. Officials tried to assign probabilities to different scenarios, including a Russian capitulation, deemed a really low likelihood. Russians aren't going to give up, or a major Ukrainian setback that would create an opening for a major Russian counterattack, also a slim probability. Although the Russians haven't quit, they're still going to come. They're still going to be looking at other regions, Sumy and other places where they can start to cause more havoc and disruption, and they're going to keep coming. The most optimistic scenario for cutting the land bridge was 60 to 90 days. That's the optimistic scenario. The exercises also predicted difficult and bloody fight, with losses of soldiers and equipment as high as 30 to 40%, according to U.S. officials. That's a lot. That's really bad, right? American military officers have seen casualties come in far lower than estimated in the major battles of Iraq and Afghanistan. But they also were looking at the American army with the air superiority that it has, with the technology that it has, with everything that they could muster brought to bear against the Iraqis and Afghanis. U.S. officials also believe that more Ukrainian troops would ultimately be killed if Kyiv failed to mount a decisive assault and the conflict became a drawn-out war of attrition. This is where we are now. It's not decisive, and it's going to be longer and bloodier than we were hoping it would be. But they acknowledge the delicacy of suggesting a strategy that would entail significant losses, no matter the final figure. It is a hard thing for them to have to swallow. They were going to lose a lot of people, and they were going to lose a lot of equipment. On that, a senior Ukrainian military official agreed. Wargaming doesn't work, the official said in retrospect, in part because of the new technology that was transforming the battlefield. Ukrainian soldiers were fighting a war unlike anything NATO forces had experienced, a large conventional conflict with World War I-style trenches overlaid by omnipresent drones and other futuristic tools and without air superiority. So you had trench warfare, you have drones flying over, they can see everything, and they can drop bombs and things along these lines, or artillery, and you don't have air superiority to tamp that down, and so it was something different than what NATO was expecting. All these methods, you can take them neatly and throw them away, the senior Ukrainian said. So what they were trained on by NATO standards weren't going to work. Now, it was better training. It helped them, kind of get up to speed, but now they have to adapt to the new situation on the ground. Now, this is where it gets sticky, the disagreements about when to deploy. The Americans had long questioned the wisdom of Kyiv's decision to keep forces around the besieged eastern city of Bakhmut. Ukrainians saw it differently. Bakhmut holds had become a shorthand for pride in their troops, fierce resistance against a bigger enemy, and they could also attrit the Russians at a much higher pace. But in doing that, they also gave up their one chance to really have this decisive attack, which is the American position. The city finally fell to Russia in May. Zelensky, backed by his top commanders, stood firm about the need to retain a major presence around Bakhmut and strike Russian forces there as part of a counteroffensive. To that end, Zaluzhny maintained more forces near Bakhmut than he did in the south, including the country's most experienced units. U.S. officials observed this with frustration because, again, they wanted to concentrate and focus and punch through. We told the Americans, if you assumed the seats of our generals, you'd see that if we don't make Bakhmut a point of contention, the Russians would. One senior Ukrainian official said, we can't let that happen. Again, they can't let the Russians sweep back into further Ukrainian territory. In addition, Zaluzhny envisioned making the formidable length of the 600-mile front a problem for Russia, according to senior British official. The Ukrainian general wanted to stretch Russia's much larger occupying force to dilute its fighting power. That's great when you do that, but it's also diluting your fighting power in the process. Western officials saw problems with that approach, which would also diminish the firepower of Ukraine's military at any single point of the attack. Western military doctrine dictated a concentrated push toward a single objective. And that, I get it, that's probably the best way of actually punching through. But you also have to factor in, for them, they're like, I don't want to lose more ground within our own country in the process. The Americans yielded. They know the terrain. They know the Russians, said a senior U.S. official. It's not our war. And that's the right attitude to have, right? I mean, it is not our war. It's theirs. They have to fight it, and they have to be the ones to win it. The weapons Kyiv needed. So Jake Sullivan, the President Biden's national security advisor, called together the administration's top national security officials. Most were already familiar with Ukraine's three-pronged approach. The goal was for Biden's senior advisors to voice their approval or reservations to one another to try to reach consensus on their joint advice to the president. So Miley, he and Austin explained their conclusion that Ukraine, to be successful, needed to fight a different way. Again, the one punch through. Ukraine's military, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, had become a defensive force. Now, that's a really important point. There's not a lot of countries around the world that can project force like the United States can. Most that have an army, they have a defensive army to defend their own land, but not really to go somewhere else or to punch through another country's defense lines. The planning called for wider and better Western training, which up to that point had focused on teaching small groups and individuals to use Western-provided weapons. For American troops, training in what was known as combined arms operations often lasted more than a year. The Ukraine plan proposed condensing that into a few months, which is great, but there's a downside to that as well. The Biden administration announced in early January that it would send Bradley fighting vehicles. Britain agreed to transfer 14 Challenger tanks later that month, after a grudging U.S. announcement that it would provide top-line Abrams M1 tanks by the fall. Germany and other NATO nations pledged hundreds of German-made Leopard tanks. Time for the counteroffensive. Now, again, the political processing of like, okay, well, if you do this, we'll do that, and if you do this, we'll do that, took some time, and that slowed things down. A far bigger problem was the supply of 155mm shells. The Pentagon calculated that Kyiv needed 90,000 or more a month. While the U.S. production was increasing, it was barely more than a tenth of that. South Korea had massive quantities of the U.S.-provided munitions, but its law prohibited sending weapons to war zones. So South Korea has this interesting thing in their culture. They don't want to supply combatants with these tools during a war. It's just part of their culture. But they did work around that. The shells began flowing by the end of the year, eventually making South Korea a larger supplier of artillery ammunition for Ukraine than all of European nations combined. The more immediate alternative would entail tapping the U.S. military's arsenal of 155mm shells that, unlike the South Korean variant, were packed with cluster munitions, and that was its own headache. But Secretary of State Anthony Blinken balked. Okay, so because of the cluster munition aspect of it, they were like, do we really want to do that or not? And that, again, slowed things down. Can Ukraine win? The second part of the equation, could Ukraine do it? Zelensky, on the war's first anniversary in February, had boasted that in 2023 would be a year of victory. His intelligence chief had decreed that Ukrainians would soon be vacationing in the Crimea, the peninsula that Russia had illegally annexed in 2014. But some in the U.S. government were less than confident. U.S. intelligence officials, skeptical of the Pentagon's enthusiasm, assessed the likelihood of success at no better than 50-50. You see that twice in this article. That will certainly come up in the propaganda from the other side, trying to paint it in the worst light possible. Defense Department counterparts recalled the spy's erroneous prediction in the days before the 2022 invasion that Kyiv would fall to the Russians within days. And as I'm talking about it, it's day 651. So, yeah, they were a little off. Optimism was not in the intelligence officials' DNA. They are the Eeyores of government, and they need to be like that. CIA Director William Burns later reflected, we could see them building really quite formidable fixed defenses, hard to penetrate, really costly, really bloody for the Ukrainians. Yeah, you could see that coming a mile away. From the time that they withdrew from Kherson, they started working on their defenses. The Russians did. Burns, a former ambassador to Russia, said that he appreciated the Ukrainians' most potent weapon, and I agree with him, this is the most potent weapon, their will to fight an existential threat. So they're motivated unlike anything that the Russians have in any way as far as motivation. A Russian soldier wants to live. He doesn't want to die, but he's not motivated like a Ukrainian soldier who's thinking about his wife and children in the buildings behind him. Your heart is in it, Burns said of his hopes of helping Ukraine succeed, but our broader intelligence assessment was that this was going to be a really tough slog. And anybody who tells you that it's not going to be a tough slog is trying to sell you something. A top-secret updated intelligence report assessed that the challenges of massing troops, ammunition, and equipment meant that Ukraine would probably fall well short of its counteroffensive goals. The West had so far declined to grant Ukraine's request for fighter jets and the Army tactical missile system, which the Ukrainians felt they needed to strike at key Russian command and supply sites. And by the time they would get that, it was going to be very late in the game. And so our slow walking it was very impactful. U.S. military officials did not dispute that it would be a bloody struggle. By early 2023, they knew that as many as 130,000 Ukrainian troops had been injured or killed. Some Ukrainian commanders were already expressing doubt about the coming campaign, citing the numbers of troops who lacked battlefield experience. And, they're in a hurry-up offense there. The intelligence estimates failed to account for firepower of the newly arriving weaponry as well as Ukraine's will to win. The plan that they executed was entirely feasible with the force that they had on the timeline that we planned out, a senior U.S. military official said. So the U.S. military thought, yes, this is possible. But what happened? So Russia gets ready. By March, Russia was already many months into preparing its defenses, building up miles and miles of barriers, trenches, and other obstacles, and across the front in anticipation of the Ukrainian push. By the way, this is a picture of Surovikin. He's the guy that's responsible for getting the Russian soldiers to withdraw from Kherson and then create the defensive line. And he should get credit in an evil, bad way for the Russian. I don't want to say Russian success, but the Ukrainian lack of success in the counteroffensive. It really was his doing. Putin appointed General Sergei Surovikin, known as General Armageddon, focusing on digging in rather than taking more territory. In the months after the 2022 invasion, Russian trenches were basic, flood-prone, straight-line pits named corpse lines. Russia adapted as the war wore on, digging drier, zigzag trenches that better protected soldiers from shelling. The Russians built tunnels between positions to counter Ukraine's extensive use of drones. The trenches were part of multi-layered defenses that included dense minefields, concrete pyramids known as dragon's teeth, anti-tank ditches, so they had pretty significant defenses. We talked about that kind of thing before. These defenses followed textbook Soviet standards. This is one case where they implemented their doctrine. Putin's army is experiencing shortages of various arms, but it can literally swim in mines. There's plenty of mines. The minefields I read one article that said it's going to take them 30 years to demine Ukraine when this is all over. The poverty, desperation, and fear of tens of thousands of conscripted Russian soldiers made them an ideal workforce. All you need is slave power, and they have plenty of human beings that they're willing to just throw forward. In addition, Surovikin would deploy blocking units behind the Russian troops to prevent them from retreating. That is, don't retreat or we'll shoot you. Yet, while Russia had far more troops, deeper military arsenal, and what one U.S. official said was, quote, just a willingness to endure really dramatic losses, unquote, U.S. officials knew it also had serious vulnerabilities. By early 2023, some 200,000 Russian soldiers had been killed or wounded, U.S. intelligence agencies estimated. So it's been lopsided in the numbers, but still, if it's lopsided and you have more and you're willing to endure more losses, that's kind of a bad place. Okay? Equipment losses were equally staggering. More than 2,000 tanks, some 4,000 armored vehicles, and at least 75 aircraft, according to Pentagon document leaked on Discord chat. But unless Ukraine got underway quickly, and that's the key, they needed to get underway quickly, the Kremlin could make up its deficits inside of a year. So Stoltenberg met and with some officials asked about their efforts to equip and train Ukrainian brigades at the end of April, according to two people familiar with the talks. Zelensky reported that the Ukrainian military expected the brigades to be at 80 to 85% by the end of the month. The people said that seemed at odds with the American expectations that Ukraine should already be ready to launch. The Ukrainian leader also stressed that his troops had to hold the east. They couldn't lose this here while they're cutting through there. And it makes sense. I understand why he's thinking the way he is. But the failure to concentrate diluted the force and kept it from going through. And I'm not judging. I'm just saying that's the way that they're looking at it. The Ukrainian leader also stresses troops had to hold the east to defend the east while also pushing south. He said that Ukraine needed more brigades, the two people recalled. But another core refrain from Ukraine was that they were being asked to fight in a way that no NATO nation would ever contemplate without effective power in the air. And that's exactly right. They're already handicapped and they're having to go through this terrible defensive line, and the defensive line's getting worse as time goes on. As one former senior Ukrainian official pointed out, his country's aging MiG-29 fighter jets could detect targets with a 40-mile radius and fire at a range of 20 miles. Su-35s, meanwhile, could identify targets at more than 90 miles away and shoot them down as far as 75 miles away. So, I mean, it's so lopsided. It's right. Okay, that's why we fought so hard for F-16s. But F-16s alone aren't going to get you there. Biden finally yielded in May. Like, where was this a year ago in May, right? Biden finally yielded in May and granted the required permission for European nations to donate their U.S.-made F-16s to Ukraine. But pilot training and delivery of the jets would take a year or more, far too long to make a difference in the coming fight. So Kyiv looks at it and says, we're not ready, we don't have stuff. The U.S. is looking at it saying, hey, why aren't you already in the fight? So let's keep going here. As far as the U.S. military was concerned, the window of opportunity was shrinking fast. We were given dates. We were given many dates. A senior U.S. government official said we had April this, May that, and June, and it just kept getting delayed. Meanwhile, enemy defenses were thickening. And that's really the misery here. Because they don't have the material, they can't get to the fight. And because they can't get to the fight, the defense lines keep growing and becoming stronger. Enemy defenses were thickening. U.S. military officials were dismayed to see Russian forces use those weeks in April and May to seed significant amounts of additional mines. It seemed to the Americans that Kyiv gung-ho during the war games and the training had abruptly slowed down, that there was some type of switch in psychology where they got to the brink and then all of a sudden they thought, well, let's triple check, let's make sure that we're comfortable, said one administration official who was part of the planning. But they were telling us for almost a month, we're about to go, we're about to go. The Kremlin had successfully exploited the interim along what it believed would be Kyiv's lines of assault. So they were anticipating the same thing and when it was coming, and they thickened those lines. Equipment was delivered late or arrived unfit for combat, the Ukrainians said. A lot of weapons that are coming in now, they were relevant last year. A senior Ukrainian military official said, not for the high-tech battles ahead. Crucially, he said, they received only 15% of the items like mine-clearing line charge launchers needed to execute their plan to remotely cut passages through the minefields. And yet, senior Ukrainian military official recalled the Americans were nagging about the delayed start and still complaining about how many troops Ukraine was devoting to Bakhmut. U.S. officials vehemently denied that Ukrainians did not get all the weaponry that they were promised. Now, again, this is the kind of place where the Russian repeaters are going to say, see, the U.S. gave all this stuff and they never used it, or they just kept stalling, or whatever else. By the time the offensive began, they had received nearly 24 MCLCs, more than 40 mine rollers and evacuators, 100 Bangalore torpedoes, and more than 80,000 smoke grenades. Zaluzhny had requested 1,000 armored vehicles. The Pentagon ultimately delivered 1,500. That's pretty impressive. But again, timing. They got everything that they were promised on time, one senior U.S. official said, which sounds a little off. But let's keep going. Then there was the weather, the melting snow and the heavy rains that turned the parts of Ukraine into a soup of heavy mud each spring that comes late and lasted longer than usual. So that's a big part of the problem as well. The Ukrainians understood this uncertainty because, unlike the Americans, they live there. We're sorry, but some of the vehicles we receive are unfit for combat, they told Austin and his aides, according to a former senior Ukrainian official. He said the Bradleys and the Leopards had broken or missing tracks. German Marauder fighting vehicles lacked radio sets. They were nothing more than iron boxes with tracks, useless if they couldn't communicate with their units. The Pentagon concluded that Ukrainian forces were failing to properly handle and maintain all the equipment after it was received. Austin directed one of his people to make sure they're working with the Ukrainians on counterparts on maintenance. The counteroffensive finally lurched into motion in early June. Some Ukrainian units quickly notched small gains, recapturing Zaporizhia region villages south of Velika Novoliska, 80 miles from the Azov coast. But elsewhere, not even Western arms and training could fully shield Ukrainians from the punishing Russian firepower. They had time to dig in, put rows of trenches, dragon's teeth, zero in the artillery, all those kind of things. So it was going to be deadly when they started. When the troops from the 37th Reconnaissance Brigade attempted an advance, they, like units elsewhere, immediately felt the force of Russia's tactics. From the first minutes of their assault, they were overwhelmed by mortar fire. In one unit, 30 of 50 soldiers were captured, wounded, or killed. Ukraine's equipment losses in the initial days included 20 Bradley fighting vehicles and 6 German-made Leopard tanks. Those early encounters landed like a thunderbolt among the officers in Zelensky's command center, searing the question in their mind, was the strategy doomed? Okay, so that's where the article leaves you. Now, you can just imagine how a Russian oriented website or podcaster or whatever is going to proclaim what they just read here. And so I wanted you to hear this so that you could hear like the back and forth. Yes, they wanted to move forward. They can't. They need the time and the training. I don't think there's anybody that's necessarily bad in this, but the lack of coordination between the Americans and the U.S. particularly was slowing things down, and the lack of coordination between the U.S. and other allies was slowing things down. And by the timing was just an amazing issue between the timing and the weather. And so it's not like they're at odds with each other, because I don't think that's what it is, although there might be some political, covering your butt going on. But the idea of miscalculations, divisions, and marked offensive planning by the U.S. and Ukraine. Okay, so I think that the narrative, depending on who is presenting this to you, is going to be very different. One side will say, see, they can't get along. Why are we giving them more? And the other is going to say, look, this is what happened. It was bad. They're off, and it's now going to be a longer war. But here's why this is what happened, which is what I'm trying to present to you right now. Okay, I hope that helps, clarifies, and helps you understand what's going on with this article from the Washington Post. Thank you. If you're still listening to this, thank you. You're hardcore. You're not a summer soldier and a sunshine patriot, or sunshine soldier and a summer patriot. You're the kind of person that really does care enough to listen to all of this. Thank you for that. Thank you for the likes and the shares and the subscribes. But thank you more than anything for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.